Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Monash Energy Institute at Monash University. The Monash Energy Institute brings top minds in energy together to accelerate the transition towards a sustainable energy future through impactful interdisciplinary research and education programs for Monash University and its trusted partners. The Institute builds on a community of over 150 researchers actively working in the broad field of energy and the Monash University's world-leading capabilities in areas economics, energy materials, and data science, and that's to deliver local and global impact. Now today we're going to meet three of those researchers based at Monash who are part of the Institute. My name is Sarah Pink. I'm Director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, and I'm one of the Associate Directors of the Monash Energy Institute, focusing on the consumers theme in the Institute. Now this is part of our webinar series. There'll be more webinars to come. And more information about these webinars are on our website. So please, don't let this be your only webinar. And but this particular webinar is about equitable energy futures, which is something which has really come to mind during the current environmental and public health crisis here in Australia and of course across the whole world. And our researchers do have something very valuable to say about that, and we look forward to discussing that with you as well later on. Before we start, I'd like to give the acknowledgement to country. And here, I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we're gathered today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And that acknowledgement is personal as well as being the acknowledgement from Monash University itself. Now, this webinar will be 1 hour, and it will also be recorded. So please keep that in mind if you send any questions in, but also, of course, if you'd like to share it with other people later or re-listen to what our researchers have to say and to the discussion that ensues. The record of the talks will be available under the Monash Energy Institute webinar page on the Institute's website. There'll also be a Q&A discussion after our speakers have presented to you. They'll each speak for a short time, and so keep thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask, and we'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A, which you'll find a link to on your screens. In the Q&A you can send over your questions and then we'll filter those. We might not be able to answer all of them, but please do send them in, and please use that instead of the chat to ask your questions. Okay, so with no further delays, then I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Dr. Ron Ben-David. Now, Ron is a Professorial Fellow in the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and the Faculty of Business and Economics at Monash University. Ron only joined the Monash Business School recently, and before that, he spent 10 years as the chair of the Victorian Essential Services Commission. Now, Ron's mixing up first and last names there. Ron's interests lie in modernising the policy objectives, the market design principles, and the regulatory settings governing the national energy sector. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about equitable energy futures, Ron. Over to you.
Right. Thanks, Sarah. Well, thanks, Sarah. And look, before I get started, I too wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we gathered. I'd also like to express my thanks to the Monash Energy Institute for inviting me, you, Diane and Larissa to be part of today's webinar. This evening we're discussing the energy market and whether it is accessible, equitable and affordable. And when we do that, we're picturing in our minds that the market is a thing that exists out there somewhere, just like the proverbial tree in the forest. In this sense, the market feels like it is a natural and normal part of the world in which we live. And because we've given this thing a name, in other words, because we call it a market, we assume it has characteristics commonly observed in other markets. For example, that it arose organically to efficiently enable countless transactions between willing buyers and sellers. But these characteristics do not accurately reflect or describe the energy market. The national energy market did not emerge organically. It's a completely artificial construct that was manufactured by some very clever people during the 1980s and 90s. Likewise, it is not a market defined by countless transactions. It's actually a market defined by tens of thousands of pages of rules and regulatory decisions. If there were no energy rules, there would simply be no energy market. Nor is it a market characterised by willing buyers. Who here chooses to buy electricity? No one. Our participation in this so-called market is completely involuntary. That's why we call energy an essential service. Therefore, if the energy market was manufactured, then we need to ask who actually created it. We need to ask this question because whoever created it in the way they saw the world. So, who created the energy market? Economists. Now, I'm an economist, as are many of my friends, and I reckon we're not a bad bunch. But in manufacturing the energy market, the market designers took one small step for market design, one giant leap of faith about customers. As economists, we're inclined to believe that economic propositions such as diminishing marginal utility or assumptions such as perfect competition are judgment-free. And those propositions imply nothing about what is good or bad or right or wrong about the world. Now, that might be true when these propositions occupy space in textbooks and journals, but they don't remain judgment-free when they're released into the world occupied by real people. This is what happened in the energy market. And here I'm talking specifically about the retail energy market. The retail energy market is that part of the market occupied by real people, not representative economic agents. Real people like households, small businesses, community organisations, me, you. And in creating the retail energy market, the market designers embedded within that market a suite of moral and ethical expectations, contrary to what they thought they were doing as supposedly judgment-free economists. Turning first to the moral aspects of this manufactured retail market. In order to intellectually tame the world around it, economics adopts a series of simplifying axioms about human nature, most notably that humans seek and efficiently process the information they require to make consumption decisions. A shorthand way of saying this is consumers shop around, or they shop around for a good deal. Okay, so that's what the theorists say. The market designers who created the retail energy market took this simplifying assumption but subtly changed it. They said consumers will shop around. In other words, they took a theoretical axiom and changed it into assumption about real human behaviour. That assumption was then embedded in the design of the retail energy market, which supposes that consumers will, in fact, shop around. Having completed their work, the market designers handed the market to economic regulators to run. The regulators, including myself, were now responsible for promoting the competitiveness of the market. Our central message was customers should shop around. I certainly went on the radio espousing this message, at least in the early days when I still believed it. But you see what's happened here? A theoretical axiom about consumers shop around, morphed into an assumption, consumers will shop around, and then it morphed again into a policy prescription that now said consumers are required to shop around. I refer to this morphing from axiom to assumption to policy prescription as the central moral transition made unwittingly by the market designers when they manufactured the retail energy market. It's a moral intervention because it prescribes the correct way for people to behave. They must shop around or be prepared to suffer the potential consequences. The effect of this policy prescription was to absolve energy retailers of any responsibility if they took advantage of customers who failed to shop around. And remember, this is not any old purchase. It's a purchase of an essential service. It's an involuntary purchase. So even though it's involuntary, customers must shop around just to avoid the risk of exploitation. Because this policy prescription made customers responsible for the efficient operation of the market, it also largely absolved energy regulators of responsibility for ensuring customers weren't taken advantage of. As a result, regulators very consciously limited themselves to 1, promoting better product disclosure, 2, trying to reduce customers' search costs, and 3, imploring customers to shop around. Regulators didn't see themselves as responsible for consumer outcomes. So the retail energy market failed ethically as well as morally. Eventually, the community's patience with this prescription started wearing thin, and by 2017, 2 inquiries were underway. One initiated by the Victorian government and led by John Thwaites, and the second initiated by the federal government and led by the ACCC. Both reviews reached the same conclusion. The retail energy market was not delivering consistent, efficient, or fair outcomes for consumers. I suggest the retail energy market did not work and cannot work because its underpinning assumption is flawed. Customers do not shop around as frequently, effectively, or efficiently as the market designers assumed. My friend Bruce Mountain at the Victorian Energy Policy Centre has been doing work that highlights just how flawed this assumption has proved to be in practice. Today, energy customers are facing even bigger challenges than 20 years ago when the market was set up. Everything about energy is changing. Solar panels, feed-in tariffs, batteries, demand management, demand charges, time of use tariffs, dynamic pricing, electric vehicles, etc., etc., etc. Everything is changing, except for one thing. Energy remains essential. And that essentiality means those moral and ethical expectations that were inadvertently baked into this market by its designers needs to be called out, re-examined, and in my view, disestablished. Simplistic individualism is neither the moral nor ethical foundation on which the community expects to receive an essential service like energy. The so-called social license under which energy is provided to the community needs to be rewritten. I know what the naysayers will say. I've been hearing it for years. They'll say, that's not how markets work. That's not how competition works. Governments mustn't interfere in markets. What about sovereign risk? What about propriety rights? What about unintended consequences? The refuge of the scoundrel. Let me return to where I started. There is nothing natural about this market. The retail energy market is a completely manufactured market. It exists only because it was deemed into existence 20 years ago. It was created. And if it was created back then it can be recreated now. And if it can be recreated now, then we have the opportunity, the right, and the responsibility to recreate it in the fairest possible way. The fairest possible way for consumers and the fairest possible way for the community, now and into the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ron. Well, just a couple of quick reminders before we go on to our next speaker. First, for people who might have joined us a few minutes late, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Monash Energy Institute website later after the event. And secondly, please do send your questions into the Q&A. Don't send them into the chat. Don't raise your hand. Please just write your questions into the Q&A and then I'll be looking at those, monitoring them, and I'll be able to pull some of them out towards the end. Okay then, so I'd love now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Diane Kraal. Now, Diane is a senior lecturer in the Department of Business Law and Taxation at Monash University. Diane's also an expert on taxation law and policy for natural resources. In 2018, she received the Monash Business School Dean's Commendation for Research Impact. So we're going to be listening to somebody whose research really goes a long way beyond simply academia. And Diane's qualitative research uses the energy justice frame of considering economic, political, and environmental concerns. And I think we'll be hearing something about that now. Thank you very much, Diane.
Good, thanks very much, Sarah. What I'm going to do now is just share my screen. If my correct slide. Oh, if I can find it. Taxes, information. No, just trying to find my correct slide here. Oh. And right, I think I'm away. Great, fantastic. All right, hello everyone. What I'm going to do is share with you the concept of energy justice. And if you just look at the triangle there on the screen, that through that triangle, I try and encapsulate this particular concept. Up the top, we've got economics. And traditionally, economics has dominated energy law and energy policy. But today, we recognise there are other forces at play with regard to putting together particularly energy policy. And that is politics, as well as the environment. The environment, for instance, or environmental concerns, was something that for the past couple of decades have been considered rather left. But now environmental concerns are front and centre when we're thinking about energy policy. Part of energy justice are the energy justice principles, and we have about 8 of them. And what they are is simply a series of tools, a series of concepts that we use to analyse energy policy and energy law type issues. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just go through a handful of them so you get the idea of what I mean. So, for instance, we've got intra and intergenerational equity, which acknowledges fairness in access to energy services and, for the future, a right to a life that is undisturbed by the damage from our present energy systems. We've got affordability, which is related to energy pricing for basic heating and cooking needs. And this concern about price and affordability was the genesis of energy justice. Then we've got responsibility, which is the requirement to protect the natural environment. Now, with this particular short presentation that I'm sharing with you today, I'm going to use energy justice to consider e-workers and the newly unemployed in the context of COVID-19. So, first of all, we might take the energy justice principle of due process, which is about respecting human rights in the production and use of energy, and transparency and accountability, which concerns data on energy as a community right. And these types of principles help us focus on what e-workers, e-teachers, e-learners, and the newly unemployed are being forced to address during COVID-19. And there may be short-term solutions to address, for instance, their higher home heating bills, which Larissa might touch on a bit later. So the concept of energy justice requires us to consider not only the economic aspects of policy, but also the political and the environmental imperatives of policy. And they all clash and they all pull energy policy in different directions. And all three together from this triangle of energy justice are referred to as the trilemma of competing aims. And as researchers, we these days use this approach rather than just economics in considering the structure of energy policy and law. I'll just finish off on a slightly different note. So currently in Australia, we're still debating the preferencing of job-enhancing extraction of fossil fuels over renewable energy. And this leads us to the principle of responsibility that concerns the requirement to protect the natural environment. So, for instance, the impact on the environment of greenhouse gas emissions from the gas industry, Taking a long-term view, energy justice demands that the Australian community has a right for a more equitable return from its gas resources. Australian gas is mainly exported and barely taxed by our resources tax. It should be taxed adequately and the proceeds put to renewable energy infrastructure, in my view. The gas industry is increasing rather than decreasing its greenhouse gas emissions. And this should be of concern not only to our e-workers of today, but to our unemployed people of tomorrow. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Diane. And we'll be discussing that a little bit more with you later on after our next speaker. Again, before we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Larissa Nicholls, could I remind everybody to please send your questions over through the question and answer. We've already started to get some really interesting questions coming in. I've noticed we have a few more new people who've joined us, so I'll just remind everybody again that we are recording this event and it will be available later on the Monash Energy Institute website. And we'll look forward to you all sending your new questions into the question and answer as well. So our next speaker is Dr. Larissa Nicholls. Larissa specialises, and Larissa is in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University. Larissa specialises in bringing deeper understandings of household practices and concerns into Australia's ongoing policy debates about energy affordability, sustainability and reliability. The impacts of energy policy and emerging technologies for vulnerable and disadvantaged households are a key research focus for Larissa, and I think we're going to be learning some new things about that right now. So thanks very much, Larissa.
All right, that's my screen. All right, I've got a slide here. It's a bit provocative. These are some of the solutions that I don't think are going to solve this year's health and well-being problem in relation to energy. So they're all useful initiatives and some very important longer-term solutions. But today I want to focus on the immediacy of the well-being risk this winter in the context of the pandemic and the lockdown that we've been through and that is continuing to different degrees for different people. I'm thinking about energy equity in the very short-term future and for households because that's where my research sits. I'm drawing on what I know of household circumstances and their financial management strategies in hundreds of households that I've visited and done research with over the last decade. And while these common I'd like to speak now a bit about why some of these common solutions are not enough for this particular time. So commonly we educate households about how to use less energy. But what I see is a lot of households that are unhealthily self-rationing. This is often older households who might be getting into bed early, maybe even when the sun goes down so that they are warm and don't have to turn the heater on. They are parents, often a mother who is home throughout the day but doesn't turn on heating or cooling in summer until the kids or their partner comes home. So it's a self-sacrifice that probably works in a lot of situations but might not be good in over a long period at home in cold weather. There's another strategy that a lot of households I see use is to get outside the home. This has been impossible during the lockdown. People would go to community centres, to libraries, they might shower at the pool, they would spend their days volunteering at the local op shop or food bank. None of these things are possible, have been possible over the recent time, and that, as well as not even spending time at other people's homes. We've also been through a period where using less energy has involved a lot more negotiation between household members. So many more people at home together in share houses, in households with pensions, in households with mental and physical health issues, and also in households with domestic violence. So while there may be an intent to save energy, it is not necessarily possible for one person to influence the actions of others. The next common recommendation for solving households' energy problems is to install more energy efficient appliances, solar PV, and/or smart technologies to help them manage their energy use. But in reality, many households can't afford these technologies, particularly now with low or reduced incomes and unemployment. About a third of our households in Australia are renters, and they can rarely do these things. Even if they can afford to invest money in improving their landlord's property, it's often very difficult to get permission to do this. So, and also the smart technologies that are widely touted as energy-saving actions for the future, they also promote an energy-intensive lifestyle. So definitely not a panacea. These things also all take time in planning. They just won't happen fast enough for the households that are going into winter in cold houses here in Australia with financial stress. As Ron's mentioned, the next bit of advice we give households is to shop around for a better energy plan. And in truth, they might save a few $100s between the worst and the best plans. But households have given up on this strategy. They're not confident that they can put the time in and actually get a better outcome. It's so complicated, the energy market, that many tell me that they have essentially deliberately disengaged from it because they don't trust that the market will, that they will get that better outcome. And then households that are experiencing difficulty paying the energy bills, they are able to go onto hardship plans, and those plans have been made easier to access during the current pandemic situation. But essentially, what these plans do is they defer energy costs to be paid later. And households have little hope in these circumstances that they're going to get the extra income to pay off this rising energy debt. And I'd just like to think here particularly about single income households, because that's often where I see the most energy hardship. Often older renters or older homeowners are living alone, sole parents of children. There's just not the two incomes to spread the load of energy costs. So while all these solutions have been widely advocated for many years, they're not going to solve the exaggerated health and financial vulnerability risks that are facing households as a result of the pandemic. So I'm suggesting that there should be a unique policy response this winter. The shutdown has been mandated by government. People have been forced to remain home, and there are extra health and wellbeing concerns that need to be addressed. So a specific COVID-inspired sort of energy for health supplement or rebate is what I think is needed, to send a message to households that their health is valuable and that the society understands that their energy needs are greater this autumn and winter, and that society supports them in using the energy they need to support their own and their family's health and well-being. That's it from me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Larissa. Okay, so please do keep your questions flowing into the Q&A, because I'm going to be monitoring that while we're now kind of continuing the discussion with a few questions that we've pre-prepared. So I have 3 questions that I'll be putting to the panel. The first one is something that's already come up in the talks, and it's definitely coming up in the Q&A. So those of you who've been asking in the Q&A about the current global health pandemic, or the COVID-19 crisis, this kind of corresponds with some of the things that you've already been asking us. So I'd like to ask each of the panel members to think about this question. So in the current context of COVID-19, have the goalposts changed for policy, for justice, and for people? Because surely this pandemic must have had a big impact across the 3 ranges of your different areas of expertise. So to change the order a little bit, I'd like to ask Diane if you'd like to respond to that question first.
Yes, I think for some of us, the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've had to just slow down and not travel around as much. So for some of us, it has given us time to think and reflect. And certainly, initially, I was a little bit disappointed with some of the gains that we've made in terms of renewables, because all of a sudden, public attention switched quite rightly to health. But I'm confident that we'll come out of it, and some of us will feel refreshed to try and push the renewable agenda once again. So I'm a little bit of an optimist in that regard.
So do you think that we're moving towards do you think that COVID-19 crisis has held up our route towards energy justice?
As I say, it's given me more time to think about energy justice, and to try and just to recharge a bit and sort of push out more with regard to certain areas that I'm keen to explore more, like the hydrogen economy. But I do acknowledge that at the moment, there's a lot of people that are suffering in terms of unemployment, housing, basic food. I mean, I see some of my students at the university at the moment lining up for food parcels on a daily basis. So we're not out of the woods yet. I think perhaps for some of us, we've become a little bit of a kinder society.
Yes, and that's a very, very visible kind of manifestation of problems around energy justice.
Yeah.
So Larissa, your research is about people. How do you feel that the COVID-19 context, I know you've mentioned it a little bit already, would you like to tell us a bit more about how COVID-19 context and crisis has implicated and has impacted on people?
I think mostly we can speculate at this point, and we've talked a bit about how the crisis might have changed people's relationship with their homes. There may be an outcome where people think more of, and have withdrawn from so much outside activity and actually appreciate being at home and want to put more energy into making their homes in a more comfortable and efficient environment for themselves. So I think that there's hope there, that it is a time that we can see more solar energy installed on homes. But I think we need the policy backup to make that possible for a wide range of households. So the households that are renting, or the households that can't necessarily afford to install those technologies. So I think there is definitely shifts, but we need the policy that helps them in the right way. And I'm concerned that the policy response in Australia at the moment, we've seen that quite a lot of money being allocated to people who are going to renovate, but without any incentive there to actually make those renovations more energy efficient, to enable people that don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on a renovation to actually go ahead and improve the insulation in their homes or install solar technologies. So it's definitely an environment where we could do better, but it's not necessarily getting the support in the right directions and to achieve, I think, what we want to achieve. And we've seen so much that we've seen a really good support for health in Australia through COVID. We've seen really good decision making based on science, and we need to see the decision making based on the science of climate and social and energy justice.
Wonderful. So Ron, then Larissa mentioned that any kind of substantial changes are going to require policy backup. So what would you say is the kind of what are the policy futures or the implications for policy of the COVID-19 crisis and what it's shown us about energy and energy equity?
Yeah, well, to be completely frank, I think we're facing a diabolical problem, both in terms of regulation, in terms of policy, and also commercially. We're in the honeymoon phase. I know that might sound strange, but we're actually in the honeymoon phase of the economic impact of this crisis on the community. You know, in the months ahead, we're going to see JobKeeper phasing out. We're going to see job seeker presumably phasing down to somewhere closer to where it used to be. We're going to see mortgage deferrals being called in, or at least the loans will have to start being paid. Likewise, deferrals of insurance premiums, utility bills. And of course, we've got the eviction moratorium that will eventually run out. And all these things are going to hit at a pretty similar time. And I've said to a few people, debt generally doesn't just disappear. So all this debt that people have basically accumulated by not paying their bills is now going to have, or is soon going to have to start being repaid. And this is going to be immensely problematic for the energy companies, for the regulators, and for the policy people. And what I suppose I fear is that, how shall I put it, governments providing debt assistance or assistance to repay debt won't be a high priority because it's not directly adding to the productive capacity of the economy. So I'm not sure where this debt is going to go, but I think we've got a fairly unhappy future ahead of us. And as I say, I do worry profoundly for policymakers, regulators, and indeed energy companies, because there's no easy way out of this.
Thanks. I think that the picture that you've all painted is pretty difficult, and it raises the next question. So who's responsible? And who needs to take responsibility? How should that responsibility be distributed? Across these three areas, thinking around justice, thinking around regulation, thinking around people and policy. So who's responsible? Maybe we could start with you, Larissa. What happens when people are put in that place where they seem to be held responsible for the situation?
This is a concern of mine. There's a policy concept that comes out now and then called shared responsibility. And we saw it a few years back in response to the heat waves, particularly here in Victoria, where we had an excess of deaths because we have very poor housing and people were not coping with the heat. And the concept of shared responsibility seems to imply that households have it within their means to protect themselves during these times. And I think we see that that's kind of what's going on when we keep putting things out, telling people to save energy or to install more efficient appliances. Of course, they're great options, but it sort of generates this narrative that suggests that if people just did the right thing, they'd be okay. And we lose the focus on the people that I talked about before that just can't do any of those things. And so I really think in this circumstance, we just need to shift the responsibility back to government and policymakers and to the energy sector to work with them to come up with some solutions that are more immediate to get people safely through this winter.
Thanks, Larissa. So, Ron, how could that come about?
Well, as I said, I don't think there's an easy solution to the immediate problem, but I think there are solutions to the longer term problem about how the market operates, which includes the, well, what Larissa just said kind of reflects what I said, that we've pushed all the responsibility onto consumers for an essential service and for the market working efficiently. So I might broaden, if it's okay, I might just broaden my response to talking about how do we rethink the market, because I think we have to. I think if we are going to solve this and many other problems, we do have to rethink that market. So I spend a lot of time thinking about fairness, a lot of time, far too much time, in fact. But what I mean by fairness isn't. I'm not thinking about it in terms of a social policy context, like say what Larissa and Diane were talking about. or in a cultural context or a historical context or an ethnic context or redistributive context. I'm just thinking about how do we get the market to work differently? Because when this market was set up, it was really focused very much on efficiency. If you look at the core objective of the entire superstructure of regulation and all the rules, it all comes down to efficiency and promoting efficiency. And the way that was seen to be achieved was through assuming customers would shop around, therefore put pressure on energy companies, therefore they would innovate, reduce their costs, produce better value for customers. And when I first started at the regulator, and people would talk about we were interested in fair and reasonable outcomes for consumers, and I said, well, what does that mean? And I'd ask the economists, and they would tell me, oh, it's about promoting competition because we want to have markets being efficient. We want to get costs down to their efficient level. I'd ask the lawyers, and they'd say to me, well, fairness is about promoting compliance with the rules. And I never found those two perspectives particularly convincing, none the least because neither of them actually mentions people. One's about market efficiency and one's about compliance with rules. So where do people fit into it? So as I said, I've spent years thinking about this, and it's actually only recently that I think I might have cracked the puzzle about what do we mean by fairness within the context of markets and market rules. And if you don't mind, it kind of goes to this shared responsibility thing, but I'm flipping it round. It's about the shared responsibility of energy providers, not customers. So I suppose my prescription for fairness is that fairness requires, so I'm going to read this, so it's only short. Fairness requires a reciprocal obligation such that if the market designs assume a norm for consumer behaviour, then service providers must be required to act as though customers are always behaving in accordance with their assumed behaviour. So if we set up a market in such a way that assumes customers are going to function in a particular way, they're going to interact with the market in a particular way, then energy companies must act. They must offer contracts into the market. They must support their customers in such a way as though their customers were indeed interacting in the way that we had assumed. I see that as the only solution to making the energy market, and indeed various other markets, fairer. I think more rules, more restrictions on energy companies just won't solve the problem. It'll just shift the problem. It's a game of whack-a-mole. That is what regulation's all about. And so we actually have to scrap the entire regulatory model and come back or rebuild it in a way that really creates the reciprocal relationship, but not just in the way that Larissa and Diane were talking about, but actually in terms of the responsibility of energy companies.
Right, thank you, Ron. I'll come back to you in a minute, Diane. First, I just wanted to ask Larissa if you would like to respond to that from the people perspective, because we've had several questions about markets and how the markets might be reconstituted. But what is the role of people in reconstituting those markets from that ground up dimension? Because markets are obviously constituted of people, and markets are not markets in their own right. People, they can only exist when they're constituted by the actions of people.
Well, it's an interesting question because in Australia, we actually have a lot of requirement that the energy distributors particularly do a lot of research with households as part of their regulatory proposals and to make a decision on what their pricing can be. There's quite a strong focus on understanding consumers and language about consumer-centric markets. And yet what I hear when I go to households and talk to them about energy bills, the strongest theme is we just want it to be simple. They want an energy plan or an energy market that makes it obvious to them what is a decent deal, and that doesn't require them to shop around. several times. They want to be able to just make a choice and know that that's still a good choice in 3 years' time. So and yet the energy market and the energy sector, there's this really strong theme of innovation and more complex energy plans. It's pushed very hard that if we give consumers more choice, that they're going to end up somehow better financially off. And that's just in complete opposition to what I hear from most households, unless they're a sort of a real energy geek, want to trade energy generated by their solar. Of course, there's exceptions, but the more sort of typical households that are pretty busy and not super interested in thinking about energy on a regular basis, they just want it to be simple. And so I agree. A sort of rebuild from the bottom up of the energy market, I think is necessary. I don't think the band-aids are working. And I think that rebuild has to have a very strong component of just making it really simple and really obvious what's a good choice.
Wonderful, thank you. So Diane, could we bring that back then to the energy justice question and ask you to reflect about how that's kind of, what that can tell us about this question of responsibility and the reconstitution of markets and who should be engaged and involved in that?
Okay, so the term responsibility, so first of all, I'll take a wider context and just thinking about, you know, what's gone on in the past 3 months. There's been a range of leaders on our TV screens every night. There've been the various premiers from around the various states of Australia. There's been the Prime Minister. There's been people like Jacinta Ardern. We've heard from Boris Johnson and Trump in the US. And out of all of them, like every night, we've been tuning in. And the two that have impressed me the most in terms of taking responsibility and showing a model of leadership, and this is not political, first of all, Jacinta Ardern, and secondly, Daniel Andrews. They have been, for me, good model leaders. They've made firm decisions and they've kind of brought people with them, as opposed to maybe driving people apart. And I don't have to mention names there. I think there's, a big example there. So that's responsible leadership. And in this crisis situation, that's what we're looking for, a model of leadership that maybe you'd like to, emulate yourself. But then switching across to energy justice, there is a principle called responsibility. And it takes kind of a narrower view of what responsibility is. And that is about the requirement to protect the natural environment. And again, I'm an optimist. I'm hoping we will come out of COVID-19 reasonably intact. And then the government's then got to focus on, energy policy. And we want to see the good leadership, perhaps Daniel Andrews, perhaps Jacinta Ardern. We want to see that good leadership finally applied to a decent energy policy to drive us well into the 21st century. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Diane. Wonderful to bring together those three different perspectives around responsibility. Now, my last question takes us to the question of affordability. And, we've been talking about the COVID crisis and these questions around markets and people's reluctance to renegotiate their plans and that kind of thing. So what is affordability then? How do we actually go about defining it, and how do people experience it, from this kind of policy, justice and everyday life perspective? Diane, let's come back to you first.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the concept of energy justice came out of the UK, and that was the concern for having adequate energy for the basic needs of heating your home and cooking your food. And so energy justice has emerged from legal scholars in the UK. It's filtered across to the US, and I've been lucky enough just over the past 2 or 3 years to connect with these researchers. and it's travelled down hopefully to the southern hemisphere. And so affordability is a key principle of energy justice, and there is a, you know, it is the genesis of energy justice. So it's a very important principle.
Thank you, wonderful. And Ron, could we come to you now? What is affordability?
Yeah, I'm completely on board with what Diane said. You know, that is self-evidently true in my eyes, at least. I just find it's one of those words, like a lot of words, that kind of get debased when they're used too often. And in fact, when I arrived at the regulator here in Victoria, the Essential Services Commission, about 11 or so years ago, I actually banned the word, because it's just one of those words that mean so many different things to so many different people, and there are so many different contributing elements to what makes something affordable. You know, in large part, or in largest part perhaps, is income. So it's kind of, as Diane described it, absolutely no arguments. But beyond that, I don't think it's a particularly helpful concept, or not concept, a particularly helpful term for those reasons.
Thanks, Ron. And Larissa, so going kind of to the world of everyday life, where people are making judgments, I guess, about whether something is affordable or not, how does the concept pan out there? Do we need the concept of affordability, and what does it mean?
I think actually fair pricing might be a more useful concept. Affordability it kind of gives the sense that if we just got the price of energy right, everybody would be able to afford it. And it kind of distracts from the reality of the low incomes or lack of income, but also the reality of the housing. So I've visited homes with high bills that have tried really hard to get those bills down, and I'll look at the bills with them to try to work out what's going on and discover things like their hot water system is using 25 kilowatt hours per day. And I can see from their water bill that they're not high water users. They're not having heaps of really long showers. It's just that it's a terrible electric hot water system, and that's what they're stuck with in their rental property. So no matter what price, unless it was incredibly cheap, the energy is just not going to be affordable in that home. So there are these issues that affordability is relative, and unless we actually look at the wide variety of household circumstances and their experience of energy bills, we can't come up with what affordability is or have a blanket affordability across the board. And I'd also just like to mention there's this in Australia, there's kind of a growing push towards daily supply charges being a large component of the energy bill. So, and this is in stark contrast to the idea that people will sort of manage their bills by using less energy. The actual fixed component keeps going up and up, and that secures, I guess, income for the energy sector, but it is also flying in the face, I guess, of households being able to get their bill being more affordable for their circumstance.
Thanks, Larissa. Thanks all three of you for your answers to that question. So we're now going to be coming up to our final round of questions. We're coming towards the end of this webinar. Thank you to everybody who sent questions in. We've actually had some remarkable coherent themes in the questions that have come in, and many of them have actually been answered within the questions that I've posed. So now I want to just draw things together with each of our speakers, and to ask all of you, are you optimistic? Are you hopeful that we're looking forward to a more just, fair and equitable energy future? So just very short answer to that, and one reflection from each of you. What would be your first step towards that future, taking it from this kind of three prongs of the question around equitable and just energy futures. We'll take your position first, Diane.
Well, yes, I am an optimist, and I'm hoping in the next 10 days maybe we'll be coming out of the level 2 lockdown or whatever level we're in of COVID-19. We have gone backward with our thinking about renewables, but I feel recharged. There's a lot of people out there recharged and ready to take up the issue again after basic health imperatives are dealt with.
Thank you. And Ron, are you hopeful? And what's your first step towards a more just and equitable energy future?
Yeah, look, I think we're on a knife edge here. I think it could go either way. As I see it, the community has endured, one of its greatest impositions in generations, and I would like to think that this will give the community sort of both voice and courage to stand up and say, hang on, we're not prepared for things to go back the way they were. And that that will be manifested through the political system. However, that said, for anyone who works in energy, and I know a lot of people are listening in this evening, the inertia in the system, and I don't mean that in the engineering sense, I mean that in the policy and regulatory sense, is so phenomenally great. And people who haven't worked in it probably don't appreciate it. But the ability to actually change anything fundamentally in this market and the way this market is designed and structured, and as I said, that's all manufactured, is so difficult. The resistance is so great. So it really will take a groundswell of community, I suppose, demand and political willpower to do it.
Thanks, Ron. And Larissa, I guess referring to the community that Ron just mentioned, let's have the final word from the ground up, from the people whose you've been spending so much time researching with and understanding in their everyday lives.
I have to say I am concerned about the experience of households this winter, but shifting from the short-term focus for Australia, we are seeing large-scale renewables particularly bringing the cost of energy down, and I think the big hope is that if we get energy policy that hastens that transition, we can have cheaper energy for energy consumers in Australia, but it's going to need the right policy and market response to have those savings passed on to the people that need the energy.
Thanks, Larissa, and thank you to all of our three speakers, Dr. Diane Kraal, Dr. Larissa Nicholls, and Dr. Ron Ben-David, for your wonderful talks and for your fantastic answers to these very difficult questions. I would also just like to thank the Monash Energy Institute and its staff who've supported us and organised and done all of the background work in organising and developing this webinar. Particularly Nancy van 𝗻𝗲𝗄𝗏, who's been behind the scenes supporting us during this talk and in all of the build up to it. It's been a fantastic opportunity to listen to the three of you speak. And thank you very much to our wonderful audience. Thank you for all of your questions. And I'd like to remind you all again that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on the Monash Energy Institute website very soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.